How's lockdown in India going? Hello, everyone. I'm François Picard. Welcome to the France 24 debate. This Monday marks a slight easing of confinement rules in the world's largest democracy, with migrant laborers allowed to travel within states, but public transport, schools, non-essential services, they remain shut. We'll be asking about confinement in a nation of 1.3 billion citizens and accusations of scapegoating against the Muslim minority and lower castes. The Prime Minister has taken to Twitter to respond. Narendra Modi calling for solidarity and national unity. Solidarity will be required in spades as health authorities map a strategy for preventing the pandemic from spiraling out of control and for ensuring a swift rebound for all of those in the informal sector who, more than ever, live day to day. Today in the France 24 debate, lockdown in India, and we're pleased to be joined from the capital, New Delhi, by Ramanan Laxminarayan, founder and director of the Center for Disease Dynamics, Economics, and Policy. You share your time between the United States and India. Thank you for joining us.
Pleasure to be here.
We're also pleased to welcome from Goa, Vidya Krishnan, independent journalist and the author of the forthcoming book, Phantom Plague, the Untold Story of How Tuberculosis Shaped Our History. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
The France 24 debate, where you can join the conversation on Facebook and Twitter. Our hashtag is F24debate. You know, for the whole planet, it feels like a case of pick your druthers between health safety and economic livelihood. That's certainly the case in India's economic capital, Mumbai.
अभी तक हम लोग कोरोना से तो बचा हूँ, लेकिन इसका कोई गारंटी नहीं है कि कभी की कुछ भी हो सकता है। किसी का कोरोना वाला आदमी बाथरूम में चला गया, वो नल जा करके एक आदमी हम लोग छुएंगे तो अभी हम लोग 9 आदमी है, तो 9 आदमी इसमें कुछ भी खतरे में पड़ सकते।
Ramanan Laxminarayan, does it feel like it's it's that kind of dilemma between can I keep myself from falling sick or where can I get my next meal?
You know, it's definitely a tough call, and my heart goes out to these folks who can't really can't eat, can't go out and make a living. And, very early, it was always a tough choice because a lockdown was literally the only tool that India had, because any sort of, pleading with people to keep social distance was likely to not work. It's hard to communicate with more than 1.3, almost 1.4 billion people. And so it was a very harsh measure, without question. And in fact, I was surprised that, the government actually went ahead and did it. But literally, it was the only tool available. I think the only saving grace here, if there is any at all, was that it happened early enough that there are actual benefits from a disease reduction standpoint. But certainly, there are ways in which it could have been implemented much better. Maybe migrants should have been home before the lockdown actually happened. And 1,001 things which are important for a country the size of India. Would have made it easier for people to comply. But it was really a really tough choice. And I think at the end of the day, there really is no easy answer here.
Ramanan, we can call up a map of India and where COVID-19 has hit the hardest. These are based on the official statistics that are updated daily. We're seeing, a wide range between, on the one hand, places like Uttar Pradesh, which have been hard hit, Kerala, not so much. How do you explain it?
So there are states which have worse health systems, but also have density of population. So Uttar Pradesh is a classic example there. So one would have expected to see even more cases in Uttar Pradesh, given the density of population. But one hasn't, because the public health system there is probably not as good as the one in Maharashtra, which is a far better system. And that really explains why the caseload is high in Maharashtra. And then you have states like Kerala, which have prepped for situations like this for a very long time. We had a Nipah virus outbreak, which they were totally on top of, got under control, and they've managed to truly bend the curve. When I mean truly bend the curve, I mean they've actually identified cases and then managed to isolate them, so that they've taken advantage of the lockdown to really make a difference in their state. But that's really what's going to explain how India emerges from COVID. There are going to be states that do very well because they've been ready for things like this, and then there are ones which just haven't been ready.
Vidya Krishnan, your reaction?
He's right, as always. Ramanan is on point here. I live in Goa, and it's one of the smaller states. The population density is not as high. And we are today became the first green state in India, which has no active COVID case as of now. And everyone is nervous because Goa state shares two borders, one with Karnataka and one with Maharashtra. And both states are currently showing surges in the infection in COVID infections. So there is going to be a lot of interstate differences as in the next few weeks. And at this point, I'm very worried about states like Madhya Pradesh, Mumbai in particular, states which have not invested in health systems for a very long time, and they're going to pay for it in the next few weeks.
Vidya, there seems to be two reasons that both you and Ramanan are pointing to. In some cases, it's because, well, there was a better investment in local, regional, state health systems. In the other cases, it's underreporting. When you say in Goa there are no cases, are you sure?
I would like to, at this point, believe Goa is a small state, and I would like to believe that it's difficult to hide a cluster of outbreak if that is happening. So for now, Goa has prepared, but then we are very nervous because Goa does not have a single laboratory in the government sector that can do this. They are setting up hotels as quarantine facilities. Goa is very popular with tourists, so they were early to screen people at airports. We do not have infections as of now, but everyone is accepting and working on this assumption that can change, because there are 8,000 Goans who are stranded, who are seafarers, and they have asked for the state government to be allowed back into Goa. Goan borders are shut right now, and this could change very quickly, and we don't know how well we are prepared. As of now, I would say I trust the Goan government for now, but there are state governments that I do not trust because they are not testing enough, and there is no way that there are countries which have robust health systems, and they are struggling to flatten the curve. And India yesterday said that based on the number of respiratory infections that they saw in government hospitals, the curve is actually nosediving. So that's the kind of data that I do not trust, but the government is putting it out. Journalists are constantly questioning that data, and this government has not been very transparent with the number of infections, especially in BJP-ruled states.
All right, so it's a mixed bag. It's a mixed bag, is what you're saying.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the easing of the lockdown. I'll begin with you, Vidya. Explain to us, because confinement on the record is until May the 3rd in India. It's just been extended. Tell us a little bit about what the easing as of this Monday, what that means.
So today is the first day, and everyone's still figuring out what that actually means. People are going out. The big malls are not open, and there are lots of rules in place. It's compulsory to wear a mask when you're in public. You cannot be in a gathering of more than 4 people in public. And there are lots of rules, and if you follow them, you will be allowed out. But the state government at any point has the power to change that depending on infections. As of now, Goa has 0 cases, and we have partially lifted our lockdown. Again, all of this is a fast-moving story. For now, we are relieved. but then we depend on all our produce from neighboring states, which are showing serious spikes right now. So they've said that truck drivers who will enter the Goan state border will be sanitized. Maybe the truck driver will be changed. All of this thing, by the end of this week, we will get a truer sense of what it means to have a partial lockdown. Schools are not open. Government offices are open.
Ramanan Laxminarayan, what is your reaction? What's the logic behind this partial lifting of the shutdown? And do you think it's a good idea?
The country can't stay in lockdown indefinitely, so it had to be lifted. And the question was, do you lift everywhere uniformly, or do you try to keep a break on some places which still seem to have hotspots of infection while allowing everyone else who doesn't seem to have an infection to continue? There is only one challenge with this, which is that the data on which these hotspots are defined are based on where the testing has actually happened. Now, to be sure, the testing is far better today than it was even a week ago or 2 weeks ago. India has massively ramped up testing, and that has been helpful. But it is not uniform. There are some places
what kind
with far
of
more
testing? We're here in France. We're all eager to have proper testing. What kind of testing? Is it testing to see if you're still ill, or is it testing to see if you're immune?
So we have testing to see if you're ill, which is the reverse transcriptase PCR, which is to say if you're ill, but it can also pick up people who are asymptomatic. The test to see if you are immune is starting to be rolled out. It's still not a great test, going by the reports from the US and other places. So we don't really have a good test for that yet. And so there are no data from these. I'm talking about the RT-PCR tests, which are now the global standard for seeing if someone has an infection. But when these tests have been conducted, it certainly seems to show that the test positivity rate, by that I mean the proportion of people who get a test who actually have an infection, has been pretty steady at about 4%, which means that if we increase testing even further, we are likely to continue to see more cases as we go along, simply because there's a large number of cases that are probably going undetected at this point in time. The other challenge here, which is true for India and other countries, is that most cases are asymptomatic. People actually don't show symptoms, or they have very mild symptoms. And so it is truly hard to identify the folks who should be getting the testing. And again, to date, India has only tested, probably about 215 or 220 per million population. Again, there are constraints to testing which have to do with equipment and supplies and so forth. And like I said, things are better, but still a long way to go in terms of knowing the true state of the epidemic.
And you talk about 4% of the population is what you've found so far in the places you've tested. How does India compare with Europe, with the United States?
Far lower. So 4% of people tested being positive is actually much lower than in Europe, where, in places in France, it would be, as high as 20 or 25% of people tested would be found to be positive. A possible reason is that India is still in the earlier stage of the epidemic. And the proportion of people infected in India, given that it's a large country, is still pretty small. France probably got the infection from China or from Italy, whereas India got this only from Europe primarily, because India shut down borders with China very early and then was watching the borders with Hong Kong and Singapore and Thailand from very early on.
Well, it's also just because of a lack of. It's also just because of a lack of testing so far. They're only testing people who show potential symptoms for the most part.
That's correct. So you have to have a severe acute respiratory syndrome or a respiratory infection in order to be tested. No question, testing has to increase, and that's the only way in which we'll find the true state of the epidemic. But also, our models with the epidemic curves will probably show that we're lagging about 2 or 3 weeks behind, maybe a month behind. And 3 weeks or a month behind an epidemic makes a huge difference in terms of prevalence, because exponential epidemics, they really pick up steam with time. And also you have to remember that India locked down very early in its epidemic curve. Jan 30th, first 3 cases from China, probably well quarantined because they were in Kerala, which is a very good health system. The first real cases happening first week of March, and India was in lockdown by the 24th of March. So India didn't lock down when there was an upsurge in cases. India locked down well before that, unlike most of Europe. So I think we'll continue to see the benefits of the lockdown, for the next, 4 to 6 weeks, which will buy us time. But a lot depends on how we use that time, whether we encourage people to wear masks, not have mass gatherings and so forth. That's really going to be the real dividend from the lockdown.
Yeah, look, we can roll it back a couple of weeks ago. The Prime Minister, who on that point of why this lockdown was important, gave an address on national television. Let's listen to Narendra Modi.
सिर्फ आर्थिक दृष्टि से देखें तो ये महंगा जरूर लगता है, बहुत बड़ी कीमत चुकानी पड़ी है, लेकिन भारतवासियों की जिंदगी के आगे इसकी कोई तुलना नहीं हो सकती.
Ramanan Laxminarayan, we've seen over the weekend in the United States demonstrations and the president egging on those who want to reopen the economy early. What's it been like in India?
In India, a lot of the people who have been affected by the lockdown don't necessarily have voice. They're not the ones speaking to the media. They're not the ones who are out there being able to protest. They are basically focused on trying to survive. And that's a very different situation than being able to drive to a state capital and ask for the lockdown to be removed. But certainly for the vast majority of Indians who don't understand counterfactuals or epidemic curves, they're probably wondering, you just shut us out for 3 weeks and we have no means of survival right now. Why do this to us? And this is both hard. It's also politically very expensive for the government to have actually done. And I don't think it was an easy decision at all. And at the end of the day, these come down to political decisions. India could have taken a route which was similar to to say what the UK wanted to do or what the US is doing, which is very very patchwork sort of a lockdown, maybe no lockdown at all, and saying let's deal with the infections as they come and lock down later, because at least then the epidemic would be visible to people and they will see that we're saving their lives. And usually, if you do it that late, then it really doesn't have much of an effect at all. So I give the government a lot of credit for taking the tough decision on the lockdown when it did. The places where more could have been done, but is happening now, is really on the testing. And of course, I think the huge problem is really of hunger and distress, and of making sure that people who are migrants, got home. And that was just a really, really sad situation here. So I think a lot of people will remember that rather than think of the lives that were saved because of the lockdown, because that's not observable to them.
Not observable to them. What's happened to those migrants?
A lot of the migrants never got back to their home villages. They were stopped at borders. Some of them made it back, many of them stayed behind because they just couldn't leave. And now, even with the partial lifting, they're not allowed to go home. Many of them just wanted to go home, apparently. They didn't, they weren't looking for a handout per se. They just wanted to go home. And India has a lot of migrants. So, much of, what constitutes urban populations is really rural migrants making daily wages. And this is why it's, there's no easy solution here. India doesn't have a public health system that can take on COVID. It didn't have a population that could easily withstand a lockdown. And, it certainly doesn't have an economy that can pay for, the economic freebies that the West can to revive the economy. So it's literally like fighting this battle with everything tied behind your back. It's a really, really difficult situation.
And yet, Vidya Krishnan, the New York Times this Monday, writing a story with their Delhi correspondent on how in many places people are adhering to Narendra Modi's message, and in some instances with great zeal, with vigilante committees keeping their neighborhoods sealed off from the rest of the world. In some instances, even there's been a bit of ugliness tinged to it. On the whole, would you say that people are abiding by the lockdown and do get it?
Yeah, but a lot of people are abiding by the lockdown, but I frankly don't see how in 4 weeks we will know what happened in this time. There are actually 23,000 relief camps across states in India. These are stranded migrant laborers, and maybe we saved a few lives, and maybe we are slow on the COVID infections, but this is a humanitarian crisis parallel to the partition in 1947 when India became independent. And yesterday, there was a horrible instance of a mob lynching two men. There have been instances, and there have been three that I know, but at least 22 reported cases where migrants have just walked for thousands of kilometers and collapsed and died from starvation and exhaustion. And all of this was avoidable. This was a government that was sending out Boeings and flights to European nations and to different parts of the world to bring back wealthy Indians back home. And there is no explanation as to why we did not allow the poorest, the most vulnerable people a chance to get back home. The lockdown went into force on a 4-hour notice. And anyone who did not have food, did not have a shelter, was just left without a safety net. And we are not counting those deaths. An additional tragedy has been that because our health system is so strained and everything has, in public health, they call it COVIDization of public health. Everything we have is turned towards COVID infections. So all our hospitals, especially the private hospitals, have stopped treating, shut down outpatient care. They've stopped emergency care. And a lot of TB survivors, people with cancer who need regular treatment for thalassemia, just all sorts of diseases. We are losing people to a lot of non-COVID diseases, and no one is counting that. I'm worried if we just value one life and we do not want to lose it to COVID. I feel at this point, because of the kind of political decisions that have been taken, we've lost way more people in the migrant crisis.
Ramanan Laxminarayan, you agree?
I think there certainly has been an impact on the health of migrants, and from the other causes of death. I think many people have been reluctant to approach the health system because there is a fear of stigma, and also it's not easy to reach. If you don't have access to a taxi or something, it's not everyone who can actually make their way to a hospital. So without question, there are people who've not had the dialysis, who've not kept up with their cancer care, who've probably not had the stent procedures. So certainly there has been a cost in those terms. I, however, do think that the numbers of lives saved from COVID would also be significant, because if we had seen even a fraction of what happened in Europe or the US happen in the Indian system, given all the other issues, the comorbidities, the fact that the population is not at the best of health with respect to hypertension and diabetes, the fact that we're exposed to bad air quality, that the consequences would have been quite large. And I say would, not just in the past tense, but really into the future as well, that we're not actually done with COVID yet. At this point, probably a very, very, very small proportion of the population has been exposed to COVID. So that lockdown for 3 weeks was just intended to buy time, and certainly could have been implemented a lot better. But the question is what we do going forward. And if we don't leverage the benefit of the lockdown in terms of having saved the lives because of the lockdown, then we would have lost in both ways. We would have borne the costs of the lockdown, but we also would not have gotten any of the gains in terms of the COVID deaths averted. So I think I would like to look forward and see how we can actually deal with this, because we're still in very, very early stages of the epidemic.
By leveraging it, explain.
By leveraging, I would mean that we've bought ourselves a lot of time now to be able to deal with educating the masses about the importance of distancing and wearing masks. So the lockdown is an extreme procedure, but let us just say, for argument's sake, that you've been able to get everyone to practice physical distancing, to be able to wear masks, have some amount of reduction of transmission. That's what really helps in the long term. Lockdowns are very inefficient ways of achieving this end, because lockdowns are sharp, and then when the lockdown ends, if you go back to behaving just like you did at the beginning of the lockdown, you've bought yourself time, but you've not bought yourself anything with respect to lives, because the reproductive number, the disease goes back to exactly where it was before. So my hope is that as we go forward, we can change one major thing, which is that we remove this destigmatization of COVID. It's difficult. We want to get people to take COVID seriously, but you don't want to take them seriously in a way which they think that anyone with a COVID infection should just be shunned and should be cast out of society. And that's sort of what's happening now, which is in the process of trying to get people to take it seriously, we've sort of reached another end, which is also not desirable, because now very few COVID patients who think they have the disease are going to show up at a health center to be tested, because they associate COVID with stigma, both within their communities, with their families, and everyone else. There are examples of people, for whom there's no one to do their last rites or to bury them or to cremate them because of the stigma of association with COVID. So we've got to reset
like the early
somewhat.
days of AIDS.
Exactly. We're exactly in that same situation where you want to communicate that this is important for a public health perspective, but you don't want to make it such that people move into a space of stigma, in which case your testing goes down, people don't actually show up, and you're not able to test and contain people. You're exactly right. It is like the early days of AIDS.
Vidya Krishnan, there's a context in India right now. Identity politics is high, and this was before COVID-19 broke out. There's been a lot of criticism of the authorities scapegoating the Muslim minority and lower castes.
Yeah, it's been. I have never seen anything like that in the nearly 20 years that I've covered the health ministry. The last 2 months, there have been daily briefings from the ministry, and it has been very frustrating that the health ministry and the home ministry has focused extensively on the infections that happen in the Muslim minority community because of one particular religious gathering that was allowed in early March in Delhi. And this, I've written extensively about it. In my personal opinion, you cannot separate this government's COVID response from what happened in late March, when a pogrom, a state-sponsored pogrom, was allowed to play out on the streets of the national capital for 3 full days. And that was a time when India should have been stockpiling and preparing for the pandemic. But then over the 6 years of Modi's administration, India has gone from a democratic country to a country where the judiciary, the executive, I would say, is under regulatory capture. Yesterday, Arundhati Roy was on a news channel saying this is genocidal atmosphere in India.
This is the writer Arundhati Roy.
Yes, and you cannot separate. I fully agree with her. You cannot separate what is happening in India is same as what happened with typhus and the Jews during 1930s Germany, and that's what we are seeing now, where one hospital in fact said that we will create separate wards for Muslim patients and separate wards for Hindu patients. And this is a result. It's a tightly related chain of events, because every day on air, this government goes out and keeps saying that the Muslims are responsible for these many infections, but they focus just on one cluster. We have several clusters around the country that we are not able to get any information about. Even when they email them for responses, we hit a dead end. But then you ask them for any Muslim-related information, and you get so much information. So that's what's been happening, and it's very unfortunate, and we are watching that very anxiously.
Ramanan Laxminarayan, do we know how COVID came to India?
So we have some guesses. The first 3 cases of COVID came with medical students who came from Wuhan. And fortunately for us, they landed up in Kerala, which has a great health system. So all three were very effectively quarantined, and there were likely no secondary infections from those three. The next set of cases seem to come from either tourists from Italy and possibly Spain, and also Indians returning from these countries. And those countries obviously had gotten it from China, from possibly from tourists or from travel there. India doesn't have a lot of people-to-people contact with China. Not a huge number of flights between here and China. So likely it came from Europe. And not really from the East, which is where India was really paying attention. Now, India shut flights to China as early as mid-January. It stopped, traffic from a number of other countries also by late February, and by early March, all borders were shut. Visas were not allowed, were not permitted for people wanting to visit the countries. And soon after, even Indians were not allowed to come back in because the borders themselves were shut. So I would say India acted very proactively in terms of shutting borders, much faster than the US did, and certainly faster than what Europe did. But even so, it's hard, unless you completely shut all your borders, to stop COVID cases from coming into the country. But Europe is probably where we got our cases.
Europe is where you got your cases. Vidya Krishnan, it's a serious charge. The messaging out of the Indian Health Ministry is biased against Muslims. We heard we saw the Prime Minister tweet on Sunday, COVID-19 does not see race, religion, color, caste, creed, language, or borders before striking. Our response and conduct thereafter should attach primacy to unity and brotherhood. We are in this together. What's your reaction, Vidya?
It's predictable that the Prime Minister has said that. This is exactly in keeping with what he did in February, when on the 23rd, the violence started, and for 3 days, we did not hear from him or from the Home Minister. And on 26th, when at least 53 people were dead, he tweeted again for peace and harmony. The thing is, our Prime Minister appeals for peace. It's like pulling the leash after all the biting has been done. He does not act in a way that shows that he's obligated to and has resources to contain the violence. A lot of this violence comes from his party members or his supporters. And I feel like there is a gesturing that he does for, in this case, this tweet came because one of BJP parliamentarian yesterday tweeted something extremely objectionable about Arab women. And this tweet was a reconciliatory measure after that. I feel like this is aimed at the international audience to seem like he's doing anything, but he's really not doing. As of yesterday, we had a mob lynching. India is the only country in the world right now where mob lynching is a regular occurrence, and this government does not seem serious. While they talk the talk, I don't think this is a sincere appeal for calm from his supporters who are doing this.
And picking up on what Ramanan said earlier, going forward, Vidya, how does the government leverage the current crisis?
Politically, I feel, and this is in medical history has shown us that a pandemic is perfect opportunity for authoritarian governments to take even more control. And I frankly worry that it's already happening. There is curtailing of civil liberties. There is scapegoating of minorities. And like Ramanan was saying, in the next 4 weeks, we will know if we made good utilization of this period of lockdown, where we purchased more ventilators and we made sure that our hospitals are ready for the number of cases that are surely about to surge. Or did we just waste that time blaming minorities instead of treating them with dignity, treating the poor people in the country, who for sure we have no information about 23,000 relief camps. Our people, we don't know whether the migrants are being tested. We don't know how many of them are sick. And we will know in a couple of weeks what we did in this time.
All right, there are things that are being done. We've seen talk about how to do contact tracing using cell phone technology. I know India is one of the countries that's in the lead, perhaps, on that score. Of course, there are privacy issues associated with it, but it's certainly something that's being looked at. Do you think that at a national scale, Ramanan Laxminarayan, you can have mass testing and keep people's civil liberties?
I think that it's possible. I think now that people realize that this is a serious issue, I think there'll be greater compliance with masking, with some amount of social distancing, with following rules, which there wasn't prior to the lockdown. And I think as long as that happens, we can likely go to a situation where the economy can be opened up, and that there is no reason for these kinds of restrictions. And I don't think these will continue. Many of the states, Kerala, for instance, has announced that, barber shops are already open, or, bookstores are already open in Kerala. So I think each state will take its own call on how this moves forward. And the economic cost of restricting people's movement or what they do is simply too high. And, these 4 or 5 weeks of lockdown is all that India can afford. India can't afford any more of this.
And you can't afford any more. And there are also... there's also a lot of talk, a lot of controversy, even you might say. Mumbai, which is home to India's largest slum, Dharavi, there was a report 3 days ago that the local authorities were considering doing a mass test on hydroxychloroquine, the same that's used for anti-malarial and lupus treatment. That prompted researchers in The Lancet to warn against it. We're deeply concerned in the environment of global panic and endorsement by the highest scientific body of India, in parenthesis, and also by the President of the United States, will create an overly optimistic perception of the effectiveness of hydroxychloroquine among the public here in France. Ramanan, that in Marseille, Dr. Eric Raoult's clinical trials have generated a lot of publicity. Your thoughts on this?
So these are crazy times everywhere in the world, and literally everywhere. I think the paper on chloroquine has some serious issues there. No serious scientific body would really endorse this idea that chloroquine should be given out as treatment. The WHO has not recommended it, and the NIH, the US NIH, has allowed compassionate use, which literally means if someone is on the verge of dying, then maybe give it to them. But we simply don't have the data, and the costs of giving out chloroquine are high in terms of exacerbating undetected arrhythmias and causing a lot more damage than it serves. But this is
because it could create a shortage for people who need it for lupus, for malaria.
So fortunately, there's no shortage for malaria per se. It's only used for treatment of Vivax malaria, of which there is not a lot. Chloroquine stopped being useful for falciparum malaria decades ago. So it's actually a useless drug except for rheumatoid arthritis and potentially lupus, although I understand it's still pretty debatable there. So I think that this is going to be the normal crazy season, because we're almost like in a fog of war, and all kinds of ideas come to the fore, and some people pick them up and run with it, and some do not. But there is also a deliberative scientific process that validates these things, and these opinions are usually provided by scientists after doing detailed clinical trials, looking at benefits and costs. And I think that is still the right pathway, even if you're in a crisis, to follow that rigor. And if we don't follow rigor in science, even in the face of an emergency, we will pay a price. There's a reason why we have this process of science, and I hope we stay with that.
All right. I want to thank you, Ramanan Laxminarayan, for being with us from Delhi. I want to thank Vidya Krishnan in Goa for joining us. We want to thank you for being with us here in this confined edition of the France 24 debate. You can subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on Facebook, and always react on the hashtag F24debate.